Okay. Thank you for tuning in to the Pro Football Spot Google Plus Hangout. We're going to be talking about some research that I've been doing over the past couple months and creating what I call the quarterback productivity rating. Tonight I am joined by some of my closest friends on Pro Football Spot. We've got Mr. Luc Polglaze. He's our NFL content writer, and he's in charge of the whole shebang. Next, we've got my buddy Jake Arthur, as we call him, Jake Bortles. Luke's assistant and our top Colts writer around these parts. Then our draft content expert and fantasy football expert, Chris Licata, and a Packers fan. And then we've got Anthony Rizzuti, our top Carolina Panthers guy. How you doing, Anthony? Oh, he's muted.
Oh, yeah, I'm good. Got me? All right. All right, yeah. Luke's suggestion, but yeah.
All right. Explaining the quarterback productivity rating, the idea behind it is trying to find a way to statistically judge our quarterbacks with removing some of the bias that we see in the ESPN quarterback rating. And the NFL passer rating is, while it is a good measure of how good of a passer a quarterback is, it doesn't include their rushing statistics and their fumbling and all those other things that are so vital to judging a quarterback in today's NFL. So I developed this statistic, which is explained in more depth in my article explaining everything for the 2015-2016 season that'll be linked with this video. That article explains the ins and outs of how the numbers are created, but the main idea is that we we attribute all the important parts of a quarterback: his passing yards, his rushing yards, his passing touchdowns, his rushing touchdowns, all of his turnovers, to find a number that shows how productive the quarterback is to his team. So first off, we're going to go into the top quarterbacks from my tier. The top quarterbacks, they were a second standard deviation away from, they were a standard deviation away from the mean average score of productivity ratings, average productivity ratings for all of the NFL quarterbacks that have counted. The quarterbacks that were counted for the study were those that either started 4 games in a row or 6 games total through the season. The others were considered nothing but backups. Our top quarterbacks in this tier were, starting from the top, Tom Brady, Cam Newton, Drew Brees, Carson Palmer, Eli Manning, Andy Dalton, and Russell Wilson. And first I want to talk to my man Anthony and about these NFC South quarterbacks we're seeing at the top, with the reigning MVP Cam Newton and Mr. Drew Brees. Anthony, do these numbers give us a good idea of what Brees and Newton were this season?
Well, yeah, I think it's a pretty good reflection, mostly with Cam, but yeah, Brees as well. When you see, a lot of people like to look at Cam's passing numbers and dismiss him immediately, saying, not as long as a passer as he should be. But as you said, this statistic adds in those rushing yards. And there's a lot on the productivity rating, as you have it, is placed on the touchdowns. And Cam was tied for second in passing and tied for second in rushing touchdowns. So that's a pretty big load to put on. So as far as Cam being high up there, I agree with that. And same with Brees. You had a guy, again, he lost Jimmy Graham, Marcus Colson pretty much on his last gasp. Brandon Cooks was very inconsistent. He had to make a star, basically out of Willie Snead. So you had a guy that was down the stretch really good in Brees, carrying his team.
And another thing I looked at with this rating was how consistent the quarterbacks were. I measured their standard deviation, and looking at the standard deviation sorted, Cam actually had one of the higher standard deviations, meaning that his average 64% of his games were within a productivity rating of about 56. So his average was a 50.41, which is a really high number. But the top end of his 64% was nearly an 80, and the bottom was about a 20. So we're seeing a guy that he's, even at his worst, typically was still what most would consider below average. His typical worst wasn't that bad. And was that really what you saw this season with him?
Yeah, if you break it down by total yards he's gained per game, he's had 6 where total they were under 250 yards. So there were some games where he didn't have to put, too much on himself. But yeah, the deviation I think is right. He wasn't consistently, putting out 300 total.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Next, I want to look at a couple of guys that really put the team on their back as well, and were a little more consistent than Breeze and Cam. Cam and Breeze, they weren't consistently putting the team on their back, and they weren't consistently putting up those huge numbers. But two of the guys that actually were Carson Palmer and Tom Brady. And I talked to my man Chris about this. What did you see out of those two guys this season?
Man, those two were just the engines that make their teams go and their offenses go. Specifically, Palmer, who was definitely in that MVP conversation. In that vertical offense, he wasn't sacked very much at all, only 25 times this year. So that probably had a lot to do with his consistency and ability to stay on the field for a whole season again. He had to put up 4,600 yards, 35 touchdowns, so those are heavily weighed for him. And so him in that Cardinals offense was a really good fit, and his rating with your productivity rating definitely fits what we saw this season out of him. And the same goes for Brady, which, I mean, we expect greatness out of him as it is already. But with the offensive line that he had to deal with, them rotating even 5 and 6 different linemen in every game, you have a new offensive line each time. It was pretty impressive to see, and I mean, I wasn't all that surprised. He put up 4,700 yards, 36 touchdowns, and his regular quarterback rating was over 100. So, again, not surprised to see where he landed on yours.
And I think the productivity rating really takes into account how the quarterback's dealing with. Like, someone we're going to talk about in a minute is Blake Bortles, who was one of the top fantasy quarterbacks this year, but he's only in the first standard deviation of quarterbacks. And I think that my rating does find a way to take into account the talent of receivers, because Blake Bortles, I mean, while Eli Manning has a really high number and he was carried by OBJ, Blake Bortles was absolutely carried by Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns. And speaking of Blake, I want to go over to my man Jake Arthur as we go into the second tier of quarterbacks and talk about 3 of the AFC South quarterbacks that all landed in this section: Blake Bortles, Brian Hoyer, and Andrew Luck. Jake, what did you see out of these 3 guys this season?
It was really kind of an odd season for AFC South quarterbacks. Arguably Blake Bortles, at least on paper and the stat sheets, definitely had the best season of all of them. But I think, with his inconsistency, a lot of that is he can be wildly erratic at times. And then, sometimes his rangy receivers, like you mentioned, the Allen brothers, they kind of, they can bail him out. They have big catch radiuses, things like that. And I feel like earlier in the season he had plenty of up and down games, and then he really kind of hit stride about midway through the season, and then you just kind of saw those inflated fantasy stats for him. Luck obviously dealt with injuries all year, and he only played in 7 games, but he really only had 2 or 3 really good games out of those 7. There was talk about is Andrew Luck a problem even before he went out for the year. with his injuries. So really tough year for him. Offensive line injuries, inconsistent play and decision making for Andrew Luck. That was kind of his biggest issues. And then Brian Hoyer kind of dealt with his own issues. I think he had 2 separate concussions throughout the year. Plus, him and Ryan Mallett kind of played musical chairs at starting quarterback at the beginning of the year. So I think that kind of messed with him a bit. But, down the stretch, he finally started to get into a rhythm with DeAndre Hopkins, and things looked really well for him for a while. But overall, AFC South quarterbacks, just those 3 specifically, very inconsistent. They did have their high points, but a lot of times they just left you wanting more.
And talking about inconsistency, I think you are touching on something with those 3. They all, well, I shouldn't say all, but actually, Luck was actually considered the most consistent of the 3, which is really surprising. His standard deviation came back at a 21.55, which is literally half of a point above the average. Luck was also half of a point above the average for the productivity rating, average productivity rating. So Luck was the average quarterback this season, which is surprising to an extent. But when you were saying Blake Bortles being highly inconsistent, that hits the nail on the head with the standard deviation. His standard deviation was right below Cam Newton's, 0.02 below it, which was near the top end of the first group of inconsistent quarterbacks. But the difference between him and Newton, with his 28.4 standard deviation, we see Bortles having a 64% of his games being between a productivity rating of 8 and one in the 60s. So we've got a guy that is grossly inconsistent with his games, game to game, where Andrew Luck was in a decent range, and Hoyer had a 24.9 standard deviation, which he is closer to average to the others. So, but he still had several games that were in the single digits, I believe. Staying in this bracket of quarterbacks, I want to move over to the AFC West with my man Luke. 2 of the quarterbacks in this section are Phillip Rivers and Derek Carr. What did you see out of the 2 this season?
Well, I think Phillip Rivers had a very interesting season because it seems like every year that offense relies on him, and I think that this year that was the case more than ever. His leading receiver was Danny Woodhead. For both receptions and yards, a running back led the team. So he ended up throwing for almost 4,800 yards. So that offense really went through the arm of Phillip Rivers. So I'm honestly not surprised to see him showing up in this tier. I mean, with that quality of weapons, he's not going to pop up in the first tier. Now, Derek Carr, a lot of times with the quarterback, we talk about the sophomore slump, how in his second year, a quarterback will kind of regress, take a step back, so to speak. But, I mean, Carr improved on, I think, every statistical area over his first year except interceptions, and he threw 13 picks as opposed to 12. In every other area, Carr was just taking that next step, and he's going to be a force to reckon with.
And looking at their consistencies as well, we got Rivers, who's in the higher standard deviation, not in the high group, but still in the more inconsistent. But still, 64% of his groups were within a 15 and a 65. So, I mean, you can see that he was consistently having to put the team on his back here, where Derek Carr had a little higher of a standard deviation, still kind of inconsistent, where the 64% of his games were between a 9 and 63. So, I mean, Carr definitely put together some good numbers this season. Just looking at his raw numbers, he had 5 games throughout the season. No, 6 games throughout the season where he posted a productivity rating greater than 55, which I haven't seen a lot of this when doing these numbers. but he at the same time had 1, 2, 3, 4 games where he posted lower than a 10. So but like you said, he is a sophomore, so you would expect to see something like that. But going into our below average quarterbacks, it's time to look at Alex Smith and Brock Osweiler, who both belonged in this group. Now, obviously, Osweiler's not here anymore, but I think he's fun to look at considering what happened afterwards. And we'll talk about him later when we talk about our free agent quarterbacks. But Luke, what do you think about Alex Smith?
I think everybody likes to kind of jump on Alex Smith for being a game manager. I don't always necessarily think that's a fair thing, but certainly to the extent that you can always expect a certain thing from him. And I'd be interested to get your statistical take on if that's actually true or not, in terms of fluctuation. But in terms of on the field, he's steady. He's consistent is really what his game is about. And even though he posts some low numbers for passing, for yardage, it's about consistency with Alex Smith, and you know what you got in him, and that's not a bad thing. Sure, he only throws 20 touchdowns in a season, but he also only throws 7 picks. On the flip side, Osweiler's a lot more of a gambler. He kind of, I think in a lot of ways, by the end of his games that he played for Denver, he was starting to see the field a bit more, but to start, he was just going out and slinging the ball around, and a lot of the time that paid off because he had a talented, skill position group around him of skill players, but a lot of the time when it comes down to his arm, he made mistakes.
And going back to Alex Smith, you wanted to talk about the consistency. His standard deviation was at the top of the lower end, which was a 17.35. So, I mean, his 64% of his games were between an 11 and 45. So you're exactly right. He was consistently going out there and being average, above average, which when you have Jamal Charles, that's perfectly fine. But
when you have Charkandrick West,
it's a little bit of a different story. And this is why this number is different than your passer rating, where Alex Smith didn't go out there and have terrible passer ratings that you go, oh God, he's terrible, but he just wasn't producing. He wasn't the backbone of this team. And in the article that I wrote, I keep pointing back to the old saying, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I really think that it just gives us another way to look at our quarterbacks and what they're doing. After that, I want to look at a quarterback that, like Alex Smith, isn't expected to do too much, but in his second season, he wasn't as impressive as Derek Carr, Teddy Bridgewater of the Minnesota Vikings. Chris, what did you see out of Teddy this season?
Same old. Before I took a look at yours, I went over to Pro Football Focus and checked out Bridgewater's rating from last season. They had him surprisingly high, about 12th out of the quarterbacks, which compared to yours, you had him in the below average production and more inconsistent than average category on your rating, which makes a lot more sense to me. And I think that's where those two separate themselves, is that consistency factor. Bridgewater only threw for about 3,200 yards, 14-9 touchdown interception ratio, which is about what we've come to expect on that Vikings offense. They don't have too many big name playmakers outside of Peterson, which is the brunt of their offense as it is. And I mean, Bridgewater struggled with protection this year. He took about 44 sacks, I think it was. And so he really had the deck stacked against him. But what you're going to get out of him is an average starter at tops. Can he start in the NFL? Sure, but he's never going to be that Tom Brady or that Carson Palmer that we were talking about earlier.
Do you guys think that he's possibly going to be an Alex Smith in the NFL?
Yeah, I think those are two different animals. I'd take my chances on an Alex Smith before I would a Bridgewater. I think that consistency's there more so with Smith than Bridgewater, and he just feels a lot safer to me as a player.
Anyone else have a take on that?
I'll jump in on that. I think, and this is coming from a guy who admittedly had Bridgewater as his number one quarterback in that draft and who thinks that there are better options available than Alex Smith. I would take, for me, what it comes down to is they're comparable athletically, I think. I like Bridgewater in the pocket. I like Smith outside the pocket. But what it comes down to for me is Bridgewater sees the field, I think, a lot better than Alex Smith. Smith consistently, just to a very frustrating extent, will end up taking short balls, dumping the ball off. And I think Bridgewater he reads the field a bit better. And the difference is sometimes his body just can't execute, getting across the field, making that third read. But he sees it.
I think that Bridgewater has a little bit better arm talent than Smith does too. I've seen Bridgewater make some touch throws that, I mean, don't get me wrong, Alex Smith, I've seen him make some really nice pinpoint throws before, but these by Bridgewater, they were rainbows placed in the perfect basket, I've just seen Bridgewater make some talented throws before that I haven't seen Smith make. And there's a much bigger selection to choose from in Alex Smith's roughly 10 or so years.
And that.
Oh, yeah, just real quick. I agree with what Jake said. You see the throws. He does make those. And, it's his arsenal's a little weird. I think they got to do a better job of putting not so much misfit weapons around him. Like, Mike Wallace. Yeah, they should, first round, they'll have a shot at making that better.
It'll definitely be interesting to see what he does once he gets some better weapons, and as Adrian Peterson starts to get a little older, but that seems to not be anytime soon. But with Anthony speaking, I want to talk to him as we transition. Oh, no. Actually, wait one more second. We got to talk about our bad quarterbacks. These were the guys that ranked in the lowest standard deviation of quarterbacks. The group is a very illustrious, talking from the best of the worst down. We've got Case Keenum with an 18.2 average productivity rating, Johnny Manziel with a 15.4, Ryan Mallett with his time in Houston with a 15.2, Colin Kaepernick with a 14.96, Nick Foles with a 12.39, Peyton Manning with a 12.24, and Matt Castle with a 9.71. Is there any name in this group besides Peyton Manning that surprises anyone heading into the season? I think that's.
I'll speak for the group. Not really.
I think a big part of it is a lot of those guys, didn't play a whole lot throughout the year, and they have a real small sample size. That's not to excuse them. A lot of those guys just aren't good performers, but I think the lack of playing time goes into it as well a little bit.
But do you think the reason they have a lack of playing time is because they were bad?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. A lot of those guys weren't even their coach's plan to be in there in the first place. But, I would expect to see a little bit higher numbers if they were playing there a little longer with some of them, but definitely not all.
I'm not here trying to make a Jeff Fisher joke or anything, but both Rams quarterbacks are on that list. Both Case Keenum and Nick Foles.
I mean, having watched Fisher, it's what you expect out of a Fisher quarterback to be highly unproductive and rely on the defense. But
Luke and the offense.
This is going to be so much fun to watch. Luke and Jake, you both got plenty of time watching Peyton Manning over the past several years. What do you think about him falling from grace and into this atrocious group after? And I decided to dabble into his numbers from the past, and his record-breaking season in 2013, he popped out the highest productivity rating I've seen with an average 69.44. So, I mean, how crazy is it to see in a matter of 2 seasons to fall from a 69.44 to this absolutely atrocious, barely double-digit rating?
I'll let you go first, Luke.
All right. I'm on record as saying that 2015 Manning is probably the worst quarterback season we've ever seen that's won a Super Bowl. So that's where I'm coming from. Having watched him all year, he struggled early. It didn't get any better. And basically, a lot of people have said, that defense is historic. Well, not only was that defense historic, his performance was historically bad, which makes it even more impressive that they kind of backed into a Super Bowl.
Jake?
Yeah, I think how Denver played stylistically with him just it couldn't work anymore once he physically couldn't get it done. And we started to notice that midway through 2014, the quad injury, and then he just physically couldn't get the ball downfield very well. He didn't have any velocity. Something that sticks out in my mind when the Colts beat the Broncos in the playoffs in 2014, or technically 2015 playoffs. The Broncos should have beat the Colts handily. I mean, Emmanuel Sanders was beating Greg Toller like a drum all game long, and Peyton overthrew him and Demaryius Thomas multiple times. And, I mean, to me, that was terrible to see because I felt like the Broncos lost that game because of Peyton. And then, like Luke said, they kind of carried Peyton through and won the whole Super Bowl in spite of him last year. So, more than anything, I'm glad he's retired because, he's changed my entire city, and we all love him, but it's been incredibly hard to watch that version of Peyton Manning for the last year and a half.
And here's a number that, looking back, that's surprising me. And tell me, Luke, if this surprises you. This season, while Peyton did have 1, 2, 3 games that were below 0, especially the Kansas City game with the negative 46.9 productivity rating, we got 3 games out of Peyton that were above a 30. We got a 49.83 against Kansas City at home, at Kansas City, a 48.07 against at Detroit, and then the 31.63 at Indy. Do you remember him looking that productive during the season, or did those numbers inflate it a little much?
I'll be honest, I was asleep for the second half of the Detroit game because I was in Paris at the time and it was 4 a.m. But apart from that, he had moments of where he looked. I realize this is going to sound like I'm calling him an old man, but there were moments where he just put everything together, and it like the memories clicked, and he was the Manning of his youth. But the vast majority of the time, he couldn't grasp the simple concepts. There were blitzers coming off the edge, clearly designated blitzers. They were declaring themselves before the snap. It's as easy as point and the running back picks him up, and he was just missing it. I mean, there were flashes early in the season where he put it together, but so often it just felt like he had forgotten how to football.
And I will say, I've not gone in and done DeMarcus Russell or any of the historically terrible quarterbacks, but Peyton's negative 46.9 against Kansas City is the worst rating I've ever seen. And I do think that it's because only Peyton Manning could hit that number, because no one else would get to stay in long enough to throw 4 interceptions and fumble the ball once and get sacked twice for a loss of 9 yards and only complete 5 passes for 35 yards.
That was in like a half and half a quarter, right? That was in like 2.5 quarters.
I think so. When I was putting together those numbers, it just blew my mind. Taking out that game, his numbers actually improved to an average productivity rating of an 18.81, which I'm still pretty sure would put him in the bottom tier of quarterbacks this season. Let me check. I've got to jump to the spreadsheet. Nope, it would put him right above Case Keenum and right below Teddy Bridgewater. But still, that one game just, I think, summarized Peyton's 2015 season. But clearly it didn't matter with the Super Bowl ring around his finger.
Just for the presence of Anthony, we should stop making references to the Super Bowl.
My bad, Anthony. My bad.
It's all good. All good.
All right. Moving on, I want to look at the rookie quarterbacks. I mean, obviously, as a Titans fan, I've got my pull on Mariota, but I want to talk to Anthony about Winston. Out of the two guys, Winston, he did put together better numbers than Mariota for his overall average rating. With that 33.19 average, it's one of the higher ratings that I've seen out of a rookie quarterback in compiling the numbers. And he had a really low standard deviation of the 19.64. But, I mean, that means most of his games were between a 13 and about a 54, which, I mean, are pretty solid numbers, especially for a quarterback, you would think at first. Was that reflected in his play, Anthony?
Yeah, I think we got what we expected from Jameis. You know, we knew compared to previous years that he was further along than a lot of rookie quarterbacks coming into the league. And, he had a rough start. I watched that was a Week 4 game against Carolina. He just looked 4 interceptions that game, completely lost. Looked scared. But he picked up the pieces middle of the season. I think he did really well. Kind of, found his comfort level a little. But, yeah, rough start, a little rough finish, but I think we got kind of what we expected from him.
Next, I want to talk about Mariota with Jake. Mariota, for those that have not read the article, had posted the highest standard deviation out of all the quarterbacks, meaning that he was by far the most inconsistent producer. He posted an average score of a 26.2, which is below average, which I don't think is terrible. But for a rookie, but with that standard deviation of a 33.75, we're seeing his average rating, 64% of his games being well below 0, but also in the 60s. From what you saw out of Marcus, what did you think, Luke? Jake. I'll get to you in a minute, Luke.
Honestly, it wasn't too bad. I mean, it kind of, at times resembled a normal rookie quarterback season, not getting the ball quick enough, kind of a patchy offensive line. He was in the top 10 in sacks. There was some definite Mariota Oregon flashes, I think, though. As I kind of digested it, his scouting report kind of came to life during his rookie season. Once Malarkey took over as the head coach, he kind of, let him run more, and then he had like an 85-yard touchdown against Jacksonville. He showed that he can run. Through the air, he did a decent job taking care of the ball, only 10 interceptions. But one thing he was knocked on coming into the league was fumbles, and I think he fumbled like it was more than 10 times, something around there. So he was pretty accurate, I thought, and especially in basic conceptual routes. But overall, I think he had a pretty good year. He, for only playing 12 games due to some injury and having a pretty crappy offensive line in front of him, I think he did pretty good. Considering the factors at play.
Having watched pretty much all Mariota's games this season, I can definitely testify to the offensive line being terror bad, as I would say. The tackles outside of Taylor Lewan were nothing but revolving doors that just kept getting replaced, especially at center too. But looking at Mariota's numbers, he had the 73 rating against Tampa Bay in Week 1. He had a 93 rating against New Orleans when he threw 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. 60 rating against Jacksonville. Those numbers really are why his standard deviation is so high, because at the same time he had a negative 16 rating against Miami when he got injured, a negative 2 rating against the Jets, and then the negative 15 rating against New England when he got injured again. And these games, you can't really blame him entirely for it. from what I saw, he looked really good in the pocket. He's still very he's got to improve his pocket awareness for sure. And like you said, his fumbles were a major problem. And that's when I was developing this rating, I had that in mind. Was Mariota's fumble numbers are so bad, and they're exactly 10 on the season, and that's something that he's just got to get better at. And because when I was coming up with this number, I decided that fumbles lost had to equal interceptions, because although we think the passer rating we see doesn't include the fumbles, but they're just as bad, if not worse, to a team. They hurt you just as much, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
But with him, I mean, you can't fault Mariota too much. Zach Mettenberger in the season had a 5.68 average rating out of the 6 games that got counted, and his standard deviation was a 13.19, meaning he was consistently terrible. Yeah. And he really was. It was so disappointing to see Mettenberger take 2 steps back this season from which was surprisingly a 12.94 average rating last season, all the way back to
I remember being pretty high on Mettenberger before they drafted Mariota. I was saying, honestly, they may not need to draft Mariota because Mettenberger looks like he could be worth developing, and that apparently is not the case.
I thought that was the case too. I was all for Leonard Williams because Mettenberger looked better week after week, but this season he just looked terrible. And him being an immobile quarterback, he couldn't do anything with that offensive line, where at least Mariota could roll out of the pocket, where Zach Mettenberger just stood in the way and said, "Please don't hurt me." Yeah. Which I'm surprised he didn't get injured like he did last season. He just got benched for Alex Tanney.
Oh, man.
But I want to go to Luke and Chris. What were your thoughts, since you're our 2 scouting buddies, what were your 2 thoughts on Mariota and Winston coming out of college?
I'll defer to you to start, Chris.
I was definitely aboard the Winston train. Not by much, but a little more. He felt, even though he was a gambler, which is against my style naturally, normally I'd side with the Mariota type player, but I like Winston. I felt he was a little more pro-ready, and as it turned out to be. I think they're both going to improve next season, but we'll see what's in store.
I was the complete opposite. I was all aboard with Mariota, and I think I'm probably, if you Google around enough, there's me online somewhere saying that Jameis Winston has 3rd-round tape, which I stand by. I think he was a bad decision maker in college and tried to do too much. Obviously I think he's a lot more pro-ready than Mariota was, and that translated into the way they both performed this season, which was Mariota used his athleticism to make plays, Winston used his arm.
And I definitely agree with that. I didn't realize I thought Winston's interception problem in college that last season was going to catch up to him and kill him this season, but it definitely translated a little bit, but overall he translated a lot better than expected, for me at least. But moving on, I want to talk about our free agent quarterbacks, all the guys that ended up in new homes. First, I want to go to the big signing, Brock Osweiler, Mr. $74 million. I want to get a consensus from everyone, starting with Luke. Was this a good or bad signing by Houston?
I don't know if you can say good or bad per se, because I think it was the only thing they really could have done. They're a team who needed a franchise quarterback. He was by far, I think, the best quarterback on the market in terms of talent, potential, age, everything you look for. So, honestly, it's a buyer's market right now where you're going to pay $72 million over 4 years to a guy who's started 7 NFL games. That's just the way it is, like it or not. And do I think he has the potential to be that guy? Yes. Considering how much that franchise is starved for talent, I think it's good.
Jake?
I'd have to agree. You don't like to pony up that much money to a guy with that little experience, but like Luke said, they had to. They had to get a franchise quarterback. Tom Savage has been around for a couple of years, and he hasn't proven to be that guy yet, even though he's been banged up. Everyone knew Brian Hoyer was a stopgap. They had to find their guy, and they might not have been able to do it in the draft this year, so they had to go out and try to find a franchise quarterback. I think he can, especially with the help of Bill O'Brien, I think that's a great situation for Osweiler because he's mostly a pocket guy. It doesn't hurt in the least to have DeAndre Hopkins to lean on. He's got a new toy in Lamar Miller, who, since he's more healthy, might be a bigger, pro for Osweiler than Arian Foster was, being always hurt. So I think that can work out for them.
Chris?
I would say that I understand the signing, certainly, but in the end, I don't think this is going to end the way Houston wants it to. But as Jake was saying, they've surrounded him with new weapons to their credit. So, I mean, if they're paying him for future production, which is what you want to do when you're throwing money at these free agents, then more power to them. But I think it's a move they had to make considering this year's draft class.
Anthony, you got any opinion?
Yeah, definitely agree. Not necessarily good or bad. The cap went up, so it's not the usual money that you would, consider that signing. But, look at this year's draft. There's no consensus number one QB, so when you think you have that guy, you got to throw money at him.
I'm more on the side with Chris on this, but I think Anthony brings up a good point that I think we're going to see inflation in these NFL contracts in the upcoming years. We're going to see these outrageous numbers that, looking back, we're going to say, oh, that wasn't that big of a contract. Brock Osweiler was a deal, but looking at his numbers alone, with the productivity rating, this is part of the reason I really don't like the signing. I think with like Chris said, it's not going to end how they want. I understand why they had to make the move, but I mean his productivity rating was pretty bad with that 26.29, just right above Marcus Mariota. The other free agent quarterbacks available, Ryan Fitzpatrick with 38.92. Obviously, they're not going to bring him back though after letting him go the previous year. Brian Hoyer, though, had a 32.11 with a better standard deviation. No, he had a worse standard deviation, but when you're playing better, that's okay. They had a better guy on roster, but I can see why they had to go out and make that signing. But his numbers just were bad. Sam Bradford even had better numbers than him, but I don't understand why you'd want to sign Sam Bradford. So, I mean, I do see the signing and why it was made, but I'm with Chris where I think it's probably not going to end well. And I think they might have been on a better track to just keep going with Hoyer and try to draft one of these quarterbacks in the first round and develop them and hope they pan out. Next, I want to look at Mr. Mark Sanchez with Luke, since right now he's your quarterback of the future in Denver. Mark's numbers I haven't been able to crunch too much, but this season alone in 3 games, with 2 started, he had a beautiful average rating of a 15.48 with a standard deviation of an 8.42. I mean, he was consistently below it. Consistently pretty bad. Based off of everything you know about Mark Sanchez, what are you thinking, Luke?
There's been a lot of flack slung around for that. I actually don't mind the acquisition at all. I think if you want a veteran backup who you can maybe trust to start a game or two because of injury, Sanchez is the perfect guy. Considering they acquired him for a conditional 7th next year, they got him for nothing. Now the question becomes, do you want him as your long-term starter or even your starter for a season? Not particularly. I think it ultimately comes down to, do they see somebody in the draft they think can be that guy, or do they have the answer on roster and they'll have a second-year quarterback, Trevor Siemian, out of Northwestern, ultimately it comes down to how confident are they in Sanchez. I don't think he's that guy.
And I can see that. I think with the Denver defense, they might be okay with Sanchez for a year if they can't get someone else to start over him. But I'm assuming they're going to try to find someone else. But next, I want to look at our top free agent quarterback of the season based on productivity, Mr. Ryan Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick's numbers are something I have actually crunched a lot. I've looked at all of his seasons. His average seasonal productivity rating, his average productivity rating is a 22.17, which is below what you would want with a standard deviation of a 23.2, which means he's consistently around the meh range. But this season he had that 38.92 average rating and a 20.62 standard deviation, which was 8 points above his average from in Houston and another 5 points above what he had in Tennessee. And so his average rating has actually improved over the past several years, but this was the first year where his consistency was pretty good up until that terrible Buffalo game at the end of the season. What are your all's thoughts on Ryan Fitzpatrick? Anyone have a view on him and maybe why he's not been signed yet?
I think the Jets have to sign him. I mean, he's not got the best track record, but I think last year with the Jets he was far more Fitzmagic than Fitztragic. You know, he's got a great rapport with Decker and Brandon Marshall, and it's as long as he's not commanding like $20 million a year and they have cap space, just do it. Like, if you don't have a quarterback, you don't have a team.
I really do think if anyone's going to sign him, it should have been New York or Denver. I don't fully understand why Denver hasn't tried to push more for Fitzpatrick, because I do think he's a really good fit for that with that defense and with those weapons they've got on roster. But I just know that the standard deviation for Fitzpatrick doesn't do justice to him. In Tennessee, he had a 23.34 standard deviation, which is pretty good with the average 25 rating, which isn't terrible. But from watching the games, this is one of those examples where you got to look at all the other metrics for quarterbacks, and Fitzpatrick's just his game-to-game consistency wasn't that bad, but it was his play-to-play consistency that was just so terrible. We talk about Tony Romo being the choke artist of the NFL, but if it's going to be anyone, it was Ryan Fitzpatrick. You've got the game on the line. Don't give the ball to him. Luke, you've got something to say?
I actually do. Now, you mentioned you're surprised that Denver hasn't pursued him. I believe it was Ben Albright of Mile High Sports who reported this. I could be wrong, though. I know I saw it somewhere online. Fitzpatrick shares an agent with Brock Osweiler, and so Denver is actually very wholeheartedly against negotiating with said agent because they were very upset about how the whole Osweiler thing turned out. So that's the reason he's not really an option for Denver.
Oh, that definitely makes a difference. It's disappointing because I do think the Fitzpatrick-Denver marriage could be so beautiful. It's the only chance that I think Fitzpatrick would ever have it getting a Super Bowl. But, I mean, if he doesn't get that, I would like to see him go back to New York so that we don't have to see the Geno Smith show.
I think he's one of those guys, and this is my personal take. I think he's one of those guys who, like Alex Smith, you can trust to perform at a certain level. You just don't want to put too much power into his hands.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. Looking at our final free agent quarterback, we're talking about Mr. RG3. RG3 didn't get numbers computed for this season because he didn't touch the field. He was holding the clipboard for Kirk Cousins and Colt McCoy of all guys. But we can look back at his past numbers, and they're really something to look at. His rookie season, he had a 37.2 average rating, which is really beautiful with a 20 standard deviation. He was just consistently above average. And then that second season after the knee injury, he dropped to a 21 average rating, that's down 16 points. And his standard deviation jumped up a few points to 24.5. And that was the beginning of Robert Griffin III not being great. And then last season, 2014, he only got 8 games counted by my metrics. And they're ugly numbers. With these numbers, he would have been the worst quarterback this season with a 6.15 average and a standard deviation of a 10.04. He was comparable to Zach Mettenberger in being terrible and consistently at it. Anyone have a thought on Mr. Griffin III?
I'm the one living in Washington, D.C., so I'll jump in on this. I've seen a lot of coverage about him here. Honestly, I think you have to consider his rookie seasons as being one of the best rookie seasons, certainly as a quarterback coming into the NFL. But since then, I just haven't seen anything from him. I think his confidence is shattered. Wasn't impressed with his behavior in the locker room this past year. I'm not sure, even in Cleveland, that he's much of an option, which is saying something considering that team.
Anyone else?
I think with Hugh Jackson in place, RG3 maybe has a chance in Cleveland, but Cleveland is literally the last place I would think any quarterback would go to be successful. I think it kind of starts at the top, though. If Jimmy Haslam can just stick to being owner and let his people do their thing, then maybe RG3 will have a chance and be able to develop in an actual system, and him and the coaching staff and everyone else not get recycled every 2 years. It's possible. Josh Gordon being reinstated would be a huge help to that. But for now, I'll wait to believe it until I see it.
And yeah, you bring up the Factory of Sadness, and I just think it's hilarious that you've got a quarterback that has so much promise, and of all places that he chooses to go to try to revitalize his career, he picks Cleveland. You speak of Jimmy Haslam and being from Knoxville. We know the guy, and you say he should stick to being an owner, and I was going to say you should stick to working at Flying J, but that's a scandal in its own. Chris, do you have something to say?
Not much different to add, but I mean, I think you said a couple years ago he was consistently above average, and even if he does put it all together, I think that's probably his ceiling if he ever reaches it again. But being in Cleveland, I don't know who or what he is going to throw to this season, with or without Josh Gordon, so it's not looking too pretty for him.
And I think we can get near our end of this discussion. I want to talk about fantasy football now, because this productivity rating does take into account rushing yards and passing yards and fumbles. And I think that if we're going to talk about fantasy, I think the productivity rating does really take it. It's a better statistical analysis than say the quarterback rating, the passer rating, which does only take the passing stats, and the ESPN quarterback rating, which is so ambiguous, and we don't know how it's calculated, and it weighs so much situational statistics. What are your thoughts about how the productivity rating weighs in on fantasy, Chris?
Well, I must preface all this by saying that I am a safe fantasy player, meaning I will take that guy who can give me 10 to 15 points every week rather than gambling on some big productive week. So that's where I do enjoy your productivity rating, because of that consistency factor. And I mean, looking at the graph you had comparing productivity and consistency, I targeted a couple guys in the letter F, H, I, and J categories, which were, even if they were below statistical production, those were the more consistent categories. And just a couple of names that pop out there. Andrew Luck, I think you're going to see a bounce back from him, but obviously he's going to be somebody taken earlier in drafts. But then we get to the Tyrod Taylor, Jameis Winston, and Brock Osweiler of the world. There's a little consistency there. In some cases, they were highly productive last year, but I think because of that consistency, it's somebody who I might be more willing to take a gamble on this year, even though I'm probably taking one of the higher quarterbacks anyway. But if I were to, those were a few guys that I'd be looking at.
Anyone else have any thoughts about how this relates to fantasy and how, if there's anything you've seen that makes you think about your fantasy football teams?
I'll just say really quick that if you go side by side with the total fantasy points and productivity rating, it's pretty uniform. I think it matches up pretty well.
Yeah, and it wasn't something I was planning on doing when I came up with these numbers, but as I was putting it together, I was realizing that it did line up decently. And when I do my draft, I am definitely going to take a look at especially the standard deviations, and figuring out if I make the right choices. I mean, last season I didn't, because I went with Jay Cutler, and I think I might have drafted RG3 at some point. But Jake, you got something to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna, throw in there. I think we'll see jumps from Andrew Luck and probably Marcus Mariota as well. Both guys have the ability to run and pick up yards. Luck's probably going to be more careful about it now that he's damaged one kidney in the pursuit of extra yardage. But your rating takes mobility into play. But both guys just having full seasons to play. Hopefully both of them will have better offensive lines in front of them. Luck now will have a healthy Philip Dorsett as well, who can pick him up plenty of yards after a catch, give him some more touchdowns. They won't have a guy like Andre Johnson that's just kind of a mobile corpse out there running routes. So I think you'll see a jump from Luck, like Chris said, and then Mariota. He's just going to have another year to grow with his weapons. He's got DeMarco Murray to lean on now, so I think you'll see big jumps from those two.
And I'm going to springboard off of what you just said, Jake, and as we conclude our discussion, who do we think, I want to ask each and every one of you, who do you think is going to be primed for a breakout season productivity-wise? I want to start with Luke, even though you just muted your mic.
Sorry, I'm bouncing back and forth here apparently. I think, can I actually say one player I think is going to have increased and one is decreased?
Go for it.
I think one who's going to increase is Derek Carr, just because he keeps putting it together. They went out and invested an absolute load of money in the offensive line by signing the guard from the Ravens, Osemele. And so that offensive line right now, I'd put them up near the Cowboys. Like, that offensive line is legit. They're putting money into protecting him, into giving him weapons. I think he can take the next step. Now, Bortles, on the other hand, I think he hit a high watermark this year. Not that I think he's not capable of achieving this level of productivity, just that the kind of all the factors aligned. And I think he's going to take a step back through no fault of his own, just that everything turned out perfectly that he went this far up.
Chris?
Well, Luke stole my thunder with Derek Carr. That's probably where I would go. Oakland's building a monster there on offense and defense. So if I have to pick another one, I think I'm going to put my eggs in the Tyrod Taylor basket. I mean, I like what I saw out of him last year. He did have some moments where he makes you say, wow. But obviously there's still some things he needs to clean up. But that's probably where I'd go if it wasn't Derek Carr.
You got something for me, Anthony?
Yeah, I'll go with Jameis, and I think you're going to see him better in the second year, more comfortable. I think you'll see a better Mike Evans, a better Safarian Jenkins, and Dirk Cotter sticking around and becoming head coach certainly doesn't hurt him. So I think you'll see more from Jameis.
Yeah, I'm going to sound a little biased here when I say I think Marcus Mariota is going to go out there and do better. But I mean, with the signings and the offensive line, as long as they draft Laramie Tunsil, I think they're going to do fine. If they don't draft Laramie Tunsil, they're going to be in so much trouble. And I said that last season. I said if they didn't sign a top right tackle, whoever was quarterback, was going to be doomed. And that was the case because they decided that Jeremiah Patasi is a rookie, or Byron Bell were worth throwing out there, and that was just a disaster waiting to happen. But as far as besides him, the two guys I think that will see a jump in productivity, which for some reason had lower numbers, are Ben Roethlisberger. Well, not necessarily Ben Roethlisberger, because he's going to be without his a couple receivers, mainly Martavis Bryant with his suspension. But I definitely think we're going to see Aaron Rodgers' numbers jump up. He had a really low rating, not a really low rating, low for Aaron Rodgers, of a 36.84 with a standard deviation of a 29.98, which was actually one of the high standard deviations this season. I think with him getting Jordy Nelson back, I think he's going to be primed to go back to normal Aaron Rodgers, like in 2014, where he posted a 52.5 average rating. I will say that I don't think the Jared Cook signing for Green Bay is going to be good. But what do you got for me, Chris Licata?
Shaking my head at Jared Cook, that's what I have for you. Yeah, I think you're right on with Rodgers. Last year, after about week 5, was not pretty in Green Bay. He even had that game in Denver. He threw for 77 yards, which I'd like to forget, but I can't. But the return of Nelson is definitely going to help. McCarthy taking back the play calling is definitely another big thing. They struggled with that transition last year until he finally took it back toward the end, and you saw a few improvements. But I think you're right on with that pick.
All right. Anyone else got any closing remarks besides the fact that, in case anyone's just noticing, our man Chris Licata looks like Jordy Nelson entirely? Anyone else got any closing remarks? All right. Stay in school. Don't do drugs. Thank you for joining our Pro Football Spot round table here. Thank you for listening to us babble for an hour. Follow us on Twitter. All of our Twitter handles will be linked in the bottom of this article or in the description of the YouTube video. And follow Pro Football Spot on Twitter at PFSpot. Thank you.